All right, we're emergency podcasting. Marco, I appreciate people hitting us up on social media and saying like, "You guys need to do an emergency podcast." We still have day jobs, so the sooner y'all can get us to like 1 million followers, the sooner we can just give you
Yes,
all the content that you want
there
all
you
the
go.
time. So help us with that.
Yeah, you want emergency pods? Get everyone, your mother, your aunt, your cousins. Like let's go. And we
Yeah,
can do this. We can do just emergency pods all the time. But
yeah,
it's not bad though. I think it was important not to do it last night.
yeah.
And
I
I'll,
I
I'll
almost I didn't even want to do it today, but we both had a cancellation, had a thing open up here, a window to talk about it, and why let it wait? Because it is what everybody else is talking about.
Well, and I think so I'll tell you my experience. Okay. I'll tell you my 12-hour experience. So
Please.
yesterday, after that sixth grade math of applying tariffs based on like an arbitrary
What
division equation. I mean, there's
Tell
so
people
much.
about the math. Tell people about the math before you say
So,
that.
so basically, I mean, the math is, President Trump flags that they decided on tariffs based on a sophisticated algorithm that takes into account non-tariff barriers to trade, that takes the actual tariffs applied and currency manipulation over the past several years. So it's all of that. And then it turns out that it's none of that. Basically, all they did was they took the deficit, the trade deficit, and divided by US exports.
Mhm.
And so what they got essentially is this percent that has nothing to do with actual tariffs applied on one or the other. So they took the nation's trade deficit with the United States and divided by that nation's exports to the US. And
And
that's
then
where,
and
and
well,
then
and
half.
then to be quote unquote kind, then Trump cut the figure in half because he in his generosity.
So look, I'm gonna do the Trump side of this, and
Great.
I'm gonna let you go the other way. But like, I don't have a problem with reciprocal tariffs. Why does the EU have 10% tariff on American auto manufacturers? Like that seems unfair. Also, I think it seems superfluous because no one in their right mind is going to buy an American car, either in the US or Europe. But let's leave that aside. Leaving that aside, why is there a 10% tariff on American cars? Like, I think it's completely appropriate that April 2nd, Liberation Day, was about hardworking men and women of USTR going line item by line item and saying, I'm sorry, but your tariff on cars is 10%. I'm going to jack it ours to 10%. That's fair. That's reciprocal. Let's negotiate. Instead, they did this, sixth grade math that makes no sense to anyone. And so I went to sleep last night saying, well, this is not going to work because if you set the price too high, people are going to walk away from buying your goods.
Mhm.
Like they're just going to say, I don't want to negotiate. This is nonsense. And then I wake up this morning and realize that I'm at the end of the day just a nerd. And a good friend of mine who is basically the head of business development um, told me, this is what I do when I sell your research. Said that to me yesterday. And I was like, no, 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 no way, no way. That's not the way this works. But like, so on April 2nd, Liberation Day, I'm sitting there saying, like, these tariffs are way too high. No one's going to negotiate. And the response from a salesperson is like, well, actually, this is what I do for a living every day. So could it be that all of us are just nerds and we would never do this? We would never go to that girl at the bar that's a 10 out of 10. We would never set the price for our research where it actually probably should be set. And so the reason I say that, Jacob, is that I wake up this morning expecting the rest of the world to be like, fuck you. And instead, every single country, including the EU, is like, we have retaliatory tariffs in place, but we will negotiate first. And I'm like, wait, what? You really will? And that's where maybe we need to step back and say, like, look, man, sixth grade math or no sixth grade math, I mean, like, yeah, that was ridiculous. That makes no sense. But if the intention is to negotiate, everybody bid. Everyone is willing to negotiate off of these levels. So, in other words, Jacob, you and I are nerds. Like, let's just be very clear. If you and I go to a client and we're like, hey, let's start with $20,000 for research, and then we'll land at 12. But a professional salesperson is like, you guys are morons and dweebs. I'm going to start at 60K and get you 30. You idiot. You left 15, 20K on the table. What's wrong with you? And, like from that perspective, I see Twitter, FinTwit blowing up. I see my colleagues at BCA Research saying like this is nonsense. And I don't disagree. Like the math is nonsense. But if you're actually doing this to negotiate, why not start with something that is nonsense and then get yourself a pretty good deal?
Yeah, I didn't even I joked on social media about this and people weren't sure whether I was serious. Like I didn't even think this was worthy of an emergency podcast because he's been telling us this for months. Like this was expected. The drumbeat yesterday towards at 4 o'clock the tariffs are going in place. I was like, what? Like we have nothing better to talk about. There's nothing interesting going on in the world. I went to sleep early last night, mostly because I have a 4 month old and I was expecting to get woken up in the middle of the night. But I had already silenced my phone for the night by the time that you were texting me that we maybe needed to get
Yeah,
on and do an
yeah.
emergency episode. And could we do it last night? And I slept. Well, I didn't sleep great because my baby didn't
I
sleep great.
respect this. I
But
respect
I
everything
didn't.
you're saying.
I didn't even think about this nonsense. And I guess there are 4 points I think I want to make. The first is I think we were already at the point where the issue was not tariffs, it was uncertainty. And I don't think the uncertainty has gone away. The sixth grade math reinforces that. Is this the strategy? Are these the levels? Is this what's going to go in place? Are we going to get exemptions for Japan tomorrow? Are the auto tariffs part of this? Are they separate? Are the China tariffs, is it plus what's already on the books or is it not in addition to? It's the uncertainty around all of this, I think, that is really causing problems from a market-based perspective and also how countries are supposed to deal with this. You had, for a country like Israel, which slashed all tariffs on the United States a couple weeks ago, they got, I think it was 17% tariffs as part of this math. And you had Israeli officials shocked because they thought that they had placated King Trump and they hadn't done it at all. So there's all this uncertainty about it. The second, as I've been feeding my 4 month old every once in a while, I like to put on Ken Burns' Civil War documentary,
Mm.
which is really just, I really just want to see the Shelby Foot parts. And I just watched this part where they're asking him, why were Civil War battles so deadly? Like, why were there such high casualty rates? And he said it's because the tactics were way ahead of the strategy. All of these new weapons, like the rifle, and all these other sorts of
The
things,
machine
like,
gun.
well, I don't think the machine gun was there yet. But anyway, so like
Okay.
we're not gun aficionados, but all the stuff that they were using, it was well beyond what strategy was. Strategy was to like, no, line the armies up against each other and march against each other, and like you're going to see how it wins, and that's why the casualty rates were so high. And that's my point about the Trump administration here. The tactics have not caught up to the strategy, and they're only doing one half of the strategy. I can make the Trump case for being more self sufficient and protectionist and a manufacturing renaissance. Everything. Like it makes total sense. And you can use tariffs to protect the US domestic manufacturing renaissance. But to do that, you also have to support the US domestic plant. You have to provide tax breaks for companies. You need to provide an environment in which capex is going to flow freely. You have to retrain labor so that they can go work in the factories. You need to figure out immigration law reform so that we have labor for the lower end menial jobs that no American is going to take. It has to be a both sided effort, sort of like Operation Warp Speed. And we're not getting that. We're getting total protectionism on one end, and we're getting Elon and Department of Government Efficiency on the other end. And you cannot protect and slash government resources at the same time. The tactic is not caught up with the strategy. And then the last point, well, actually, two other things I wanted to say, and then I'll shut up. And maybe I'm wrong about this, but I feel like the power of tariffs as leverage was strongest as a threat. Once you pull the lever, like, yes, maybe some of these countries will negotiate on a short term basis, but you've already cast the die. It's sort of like Huawei. The United States under Trump in the first term crippled Huawei for years. And now Huawei is back from the dead because all the things that the United States did to Huawei made them figure out, oh, we can't rely on these things anymore. We're going to go in a hole, try to survive, and come back later, 4 or 5 years stronger, more self-sufficient. That's exactly what they did. And all of these countries, even if they're willing to negotiate in the short term because they think they can get a better deal in the short term, are going to be internally saying, okay, we can't depend on the United States anymore. The lever's been pulled. We need to make sure in 5 years' time, when this happens again, we're in a stronger negotiating position. And then the last thing, and honestly, this might be the most geopolitically significant thing in the whole game. I'm sure you saw, like, on his ridiculous framed poster of the tariff rates with the sixth grade math, Taiwan was listed as a country. So are we done with one China principle? Like, is that just out the window? Like, if I'm in China, I'm wondering. Anyway, what do you
That was
think?
actually that was actually the cutest part of this whole thing, which was when Beijing goes out and says like, "Whoa, whoa, Taiwan is not a country. Don't you be applying tariffs in our province." And I was like, "Wait, is that like, are they kind of defending Taiwan there? Like, I don't know." Um, So I would say that first of all, if you're sitting at home and you're saying to yourself, okay, but our market is the biggest market in the world, and this is one of the arguments that the MAGA camp has made, like, well, you have to have access to the US. The rest of the world has to sell to us. They have nowhere else to sell. So what I would say is that that is correct if you individually go after countries one by one, or maybe two, maybe three, maybe four, maybe the EU at the same time, or China in 2018. Like that's correct. Yes. But when you go against the entire world at the same time, that is a really huge own goal for the United States of America.
Hmm.
So, first of all, the US is riding a 6-year, 7-year high of fiscal policy. President Trump agrees with me, just to be very clear. This is not a liberal point. This is not a conservative point. This is a fact, and it's one that Elon Musk and Doge are trying to undo. The
Hmm.
United States of America has outperformed the rest of the world because the US responded to COVID as if it was the Nazis and Japanese at the same time. Like the United States of America overspent by 4 times relative to everyone else the last 5 years. Nobody did as much fiscal policy. We've been riding on the hog of a fiscal orgy. Okay, it's an or
Riding
I love
riding on the hog of a fiscal orgy. Can I make that the title of the episode? Or they probably won't
please
like that one.
fiscal. I mean, look, it's about trade wars, so like not really. But my point is like if you're sitting there as member of the MAGA camp, or a Trump supporter, and you're saying like Joe Biden economy is an economy wreathed in fiscal policy. God bless you, you're correct. Although I would argue then objectively that really President Trump started the fiscal orgy in 2017 with the
Yep.
first
Hmm.
pro-cyclical fiscal stimulus. Doesn't matter. The
Or
point
or
is,
was it
though,
President Obama when he bailed out all of the companies in 2008?
not really because it was not sufficient. We actually got secular stagnation because that
That's true,
fiscal
actually.
response was not enough. But like, look, what I'm trying to say is that don't sit there and say to the rest of the world, we have the best economy. And at the same time, argue that Joe Biden's profligacy propped it up. Like the United States of America does not have a monopoly over the strongest economy in the world. These things go up and down. And what the US is doing right now is it's unwinding the fiscal support, which has to happen because, it's just unsustainable. At the same time that it's fighting a trade war with everyone else, while everyone else is not fighting a trade war with everyone else.
Mhm.
All right. So, like, let's just be very clear here. I'm going to break this down because people who do sixth grade math might need this to be like diagrammed a little bit. So, let me say this again. Like, America is fighting a global trade war, the rest of the world is not. So, what they're going to do is because they have fiscal room, because they didn't blow a massive amount of money on fighting the common cold, which is what basically the pandemic ended up being. They didn't do that. You did. They now have room to stimulate their economies. Oh, yeah, they do. Oh, yes, they do. Like people say Europe doesn't have room. It's only Germany. Like, what does that mean? That would be like saying the entire northeast of America. Like, Germany's huge, okay? They got plenty, they got wallops of room to stimulate. And the EU is going to use this as an excuse. It's an external attack. They're going to issue joint bonds and stuff like that. Canada, China, they're all going to stimulate their economies and they're going to make it easier to trade with each other. And oh, yes, they can replace you. They can. So that is the biggest own goal here. It's not about the recession, it's not about markets going down. The own goal here is that if President Trump means this to be permanent, there will be a permanent reorientation of trade flows away from the US. And with those trade flows and with that money and with that exchange of goods, services, and people also comes influence and geopolitical power and relevance.
I'm sure you saw earlier, I forget if it was Sunday or Monday, Chinese state media had this report that China, South Korea, and Japan had met and had agreed to like sort of correlate their trade policy response to whatever was going to happen on Liberation Day in the United States. That was the Chinese line. The South Korean line was like, yeah, we talked, but like we didn't actually agree to anything. It wasn't that big of a deal. And the Japanese were like, absolutely not. We did not participate in this meeting. This did not happen whatsoever. And I think that's one of the reasons. If you look at like Japanese press today, they're shocked. They can't believe they got sort of lumped in with all these other countries. They thought for sure that they were going to get some of the break. And it's exactly to your point. Like earlier this week, that for me, that was a signal, even though it was probably put out by the Chinese to sort of try and create an image of something that wasn't true. That's exactly the sort of thing that it's going to create. And honestly, I think that was Biden's biggest foreign policy success that he never got enough credit for. South Korea and Japan were bickering with each other when he got to office, and the first Trump administration had really only made that situation worse. And Biden knocked their heads together and said, "Enough of this. Like, y'all need to get on the same page, and we're all going to start sharing intelligence again. And China's the bigger threat, and we got to deal with North Korea." And that trilateral has worked very well up until now. Trump has already sort of completely undone that.
This is why we're cousins. This is why, because I saw that item. I was going to send it to my clients as like, whoa, watch out. South Korea, Japan, and China coordinating. And then I read the Reuters article, Jacob, and in it, like the Japanese were like, this is nonsense. The South Koreans were like, whoa, this is an exaggeration. Okay. And then this morning I thought about it again, just like you
Yeah.
did. I'm like, yeah, I bet it's not an exaggeration now, is it, South Korea? Like, so the South, like, but it's, and you can go across the entire world. Like that's the point. Like, it's not about South Korea, Japan, and China. Who cares? Like, it's about everybody out there saying, sitting there. And so, look, there's a couple of ways to look at this. On one hand, like maybe Trump is like, that really nasty, smelly fish oil they used to feed kids to be smart, right? So, like, what do I mean by that? Well, you have to swallow a teaspoon of Trump if you're Europe. You've got so many inefficiencies. What are you doing?
Hmm.
You never completed your single market. Like, people don't know this, but the European Union is really a free trade zone for like trade goods. But on services, which is what matters in 21st century, they actually don't have a single market. It's broken. It's full of
Hmm.
internal barriers. Canada, intra-provincial trade is not free. I don't know how many people listening to this know that. Like, there are trade barriers between provinces of Canada. They've been trying to fix it for 250 years. Well, guess what? You take a spoonful of Trump, you hold your nose because it's smelly and like doesn't taste good. Boom. So in a way, like again, you can look at this from a positive perspective. What Trump is doing is he's forcing the rest of the world to also come off of fiscal orgy of America. You can't just depend on Americans being irresponsible and buying your stuff. You're going to have to reform your own economies. But the point is, again, the point from an America first perspective, if you're a lover of Trump and lover of MAGA, like, let's just be very clear, this is going to benefit the rest of the world. That's my point. And in a way, again, you can think of Trump as a sort of a mean reversion fairy. He's inciting this change. Europeans are going to integrate further. They're going to issue bonds to spend a lot of money to fix their infrastructure. They're going to have a single market in services. The Canadians are finally going to break down barriers between like Alberta and British Columbia. What? Like, you know? And what does America get? We're going to pick our own strawberries, to go back to that famous line from Dave Chappelle.
Yeah. No. Well, it goes to your point though. Like, and this is what I meant about the tactics being ahead of the strategy, because I can get on board with the strategy. I can make the case for it, but you're going to have more fiscal. Like, you're going to have to hope that by doing all of this, you're going to outgrow the problems that you're going to have on a 3 to 5, 10-year
But you
time
can't.
horizon.
But you can't.
Exactly.
You can't. And you
So,
can't, just to be clear, you can't because Sleepy Joe and Donnie both blew a lot of cash on nonsense. So the United States of America panicked after the pandemic and basically spent money, like it rained money on people for all sorts of reasons. I think the underlying reason that the Pelosi Trump administration, that's what I call it, Trump and Pelosi were lockstep after the pandemic. They were trying to outbid one another who was going to spend more money. What did they use that money on? Helicopter drops on people. Why? Because the fundamental problem behind all of this, Jacob, the only problem is income inequality in the United States of America. So the pandemic happens and we shower the population with cash. Like Trump comes back to power and he's like, okay, we're going to fix the problems of the Midwest by bringing back factories where robots are going to work, by the way, and you're going to be, like basically like cleaning the robots if you do get a job in a factory. So like everything, every policymaker, whether you're on the left or the right in the United States of America over the last, I would say 7, 8, 10 years, has been trying to fix this problem of income inequality. but they're doing it in such extreme fashion, either hosing people down with cash, so now we don't have any more fiscal space, or, oh, it's everybody else's fault. They owe us for their sweet taste of liberty, so we're going to put tariffs in place. And these are suboptimal outcomes in both cases. In both cases, they're suboptimal outcomes, whether you're left or right. And so fundamentally, what's going to happen is an exodus of capital out of the US. I think that's my kind of conclusion here. And by the way, that's what the market is saying. We don't want to really talk too much about markets here, but if you look at what's happening right now over the last 6 weeks, not just today, US stocks have gone down more than the rest of the world, and the dollar is getting killed. And that's not what was supposed to happen in a trade war. That's
Mhm.
not what people thought would happen, and yet it is happening.
Yeah. I want to push. I want to push back against you a little bit, which is to say, um, like the pandemic. I don't blame the administrations for how they responded to the pandemic. There was a lot of uncertainty in the moment about what COVID was and what it wasn't. And with the benefit of hindsight, we can say, oh, like similar to the cold or something like that. We definitely overshot the mark. But at the time, there was a lot of uncertainty and there was a lot of fear. And I think like the you have to judge the policy response based on the fear that was there at the time. Now that doesn't excuse maybe some of the spending that was happening in 22 and 23 and beyond. But I'm not one who backtracks and looks at that sort of thing. But the place I want to push back on is I think the US does have more fiscal space. I don't think that we're at the point yet where we have to be cutting anything. And I think the Trump administration is going to fall back into fiscal. And maybe that's going to be bad in the long run. But that leak that Elon Musk is on his way out that Trump did to Politico earlier this week, that to me is the first signal that he's waking up to it and that he is going to have to helicopter some of these parts of the economy
That's
if
going
he's
to be
going
tough.
to do this.
That's going to be very tough. I mean, I think the market freaks. But the other thing is like, look, the reason that I can definitively say that the Trump Pelosi administration overdid fiscal is that nobody else did. Nobody else did what America did. And you cannot tell me, Jacob, that we in the United States of America cared about COVID more than other countries. That's obviously like empirically not true because we didn't. We had like people like, partying in Florida. Like if you look at the aggregate United States reaction to COVID, that reaction does not tell me. Like US may have been more concerned than Sweden or Switzerland, but clearly it did not. It was like one of the more looser sort of countries. So then why did we spend 4 times more than all of Europe? 4 times more is because they were social engineering something. They used COVID as an opportunity to provide a palliative solution to the problems of the 2000s, which is, I think, income inequality. It was a moment to solve this or try to, and not solve it, but obviously they didn't solve it. And now
Yeah,
President Trump is again trying to do it with tariffs. Like, and if you step back and squint at it, Jacob, when you squint at something and you just kind of try to look at what's going on here, it's all about income inequality. And it's like about Republicans approaching it their way, Democrats approaching it their way. Sometimes they come together. But the reason this is a relevant conversation now is because, yeah, I mean, like the US, I think, is not going to be able to counter this. And they're fighting a war with everyone else. That everyone else is just going to move on. And that's where the MAGA camp, again, if you want to go against Europe for having 10% tariff on the cars, yeah, that's a great idea. Like you should. Like reciprocity. Like why should Europe apply 10% tariff on American cars? It's unfair.
mhm.
But when you wage a war against everybody and they don't wage a war against each other, well, then you're going to lose. Doesn't matter how big your economy is, and the U.S. is not bigger than China and Europe and South Korea and Japan and Australia and South Korea and Canada and so on.
Yeah, I think we mostly agree on COVID. I think it's more of a semantic difference. I just think there was a two-step process that happened. There was the initial response after the virus, which I think was
Yeah, yeah, I agree with that.
I don't want to say correct, and then
And
there
then
was the
yeah,
social engineering that was like, oh, let's use this to fix this. It happened with masks too. Like the point of masks and personal protective equipment was try and buy the hospital system as much time as possible to prepare for what's coming. It was not sit in your house for a year. And somewhere between what the
mm,
messaging was, it went from, okay, masks for the next 6 weeks and stay shelter in place so that we can get the healthcare system ready for the onslaught that is coming to you have to stay inside. And then it became the sort of culture identity
well,
war.
you
And
know what?
I'm harping on this because I think we did such a bad job of this in the US and another pandemic is going to come.
Oh yeah.
And we have RFK Jr. running around health services. Like this, in some ways, disturbs me more than anything else that's
Well,
happening.
no, actually, Jacob, I think we should have when things calm down, which maybe never, a whole podcast on this, which will probably get me canceled. But I think that this is probably the one issue we will probably disagree with each other the most. And I'm
Mhm.
so thankful for not having had social media accounts or a podcast during the COVID because I would have
Oh,
100% been canceled. So I'm just going to leave it at that, and then we're going to have a nice conversation now that it's over. So yes, going back to trade and tariffs. I mean, like when I step back, I do think that when you think about geopolitical power of the United States, and I want to hear what you think about this. There's various ways to measure hegemony or power. One is aircraft carriers. Like, ooh, America has 13 aircraft
mhm.
carriers. I don't know
Yeah.
actually know how many it is now. I think it's
I
like
think it's 9. I think.
9, okay.
I think.
And another like 8, 10 helicopter carriers, which in the rest of the world would count as aircraft carriers. So the US has this power projection capability, great technology, R&D, all that stuff. But one of them has always been access to the US market because there's always a sword of Damocles, right? Like if you're naughty, we will cut your access to the market. And that has always been part of this hegemonic like array of powers. And so I think there's many reasons why the US should use tariffs, right? Whether it's to help a particular industry that's critical, not bicycles, you know? So, like, just to be clear, helping a particular industry that's critical, that's one reason to use the tariff. Another reason to use the tariff is like, hey, again, reciprocity. Why is Europe applying these tariffs? It's not fair. Getting to fair trade. And then the last one is geopolitical. Like, hey, you're naughty, like Serbia is naughty, 1999. You're not going to have access to the American market. Like, that makes perfect sense. But when you apply it to the rest of the world all at the same time, in a kind of a punitive way. And if the purpose is not to negotiate, which I'm open that President Trump is actually doing this to negotiate. Again, I'm open to it. I think we may be too much of a nerds and balking at the price, right? As I said at the beginning, I'm open to that. But if that's not what this is about, if this is about correcting like income inequality in America, which like I don't know, maybe you should redistribute wealth like everybody else does, but like let's leave that aside. If this is about just like F it, we're out, well then you're going to be weaker geopolitically. Like facts. That's a fact.
Yeah. You know how Bill Simmons has conspiracy Bill? I feel like what you just said about redistributing wealth. I think we need communist Marko to come out every once in a while to respond to things in a Marxist
Communist
way.
Marko would say, like, look, what honestly, like, this is the fundamental issue here is that the US cannot solve its income inequality problem through legislation. Like the Democrats and the Republicans cannot agree to a set of policies.
Hmm.
And it's not communist Marko because I think in many ways, many of American policies would be solved with supply side reform. Like, I don't think healthcare necessarily needs to be like universal or socialized, but I do think that supply needs to be expanded, which means like,
Hmm.
the American Medical Association does not get to like decide how many universities issues degrees or like, no, we need like massive supply increase. Sorry. I know your members of your family are doctors. Like in my
Oh, I'm
world,
not worried.
their costs go down. But look, what I'm saying is like there's many supply side solutions that can be fixed, that they can be used but there is also redistribution of wealth as well. Like, and probably tertiary education needs to be, cheaper. Like, my point is, it doesn't matter what communist Marko thinks. What matters is that none of these policies will ever be instituted, whether it's laissez-faire Chicago School Marko or communist Marko. None of the Markos are going to be implemented because the two parties are at each other's throats. So every time they get a little bit like pissy about income inequality, they either wash the people in cash or they adopt these kind of extreme measures like, oh, we need to help the Midwest Rust Belt workers, let's apply 80% tariffs so they can what? Pick their own strawberries and like build bicycles? Like, doesn't make sense.
Yeah, it's going to happen eventually. It's just that the U.S. economy has been so good, and as you said, whether it's the hog of the fiscal orgy or whether it's been more solid fundamentals or somewhere in between. But the last time that we had the real kind of stepwise change that you're talking about, it came on the back of the Great Depression and the stock market collapse and the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the Democrats controlling both houses and a president who was willing to be activist. And ironically, if Trump sticks with these things, if he really believes in this and he sticks with this 100% of the way, maybe he gets us closer to the economic crisis that causes the party lines to be completely redrawn. And maybe it'll be the Dems, maybe it'll be the Republicans. We won't recognize them when it gets to this point in the political process, but they will take over and they'll have a mandate to actually, force through the type of changes that you're talking about. But I think that's a good way to segue into what I wanted to ask you next, or get your opinion on, because it seems to me that there's three scenarios here going forward. Scenario number one, and this is my base case, is that, like you said, this is about negotiation. That in short order there will be exemptions and deals, and in a couple of weeks probably, like, you'll get all these countries that are U.S. allies that they'll make some deals around the edges. Maybe for China and some of these others, the tariffs stay on. But that, broadly speaking, this was an opening salvo to a broader renegotiation, and it'll happen relatively quick. The second, door number two, is no, 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 no. He believes this stuff. Like, he really thinks he's William McKinley. He really thinks it's 1899. He really thinks that this is the medicine that the US needs, which to me says sharp spike in inflation followed by deflationary spiral, Republican slaughter in the midterms, a really, really sort of dark scenario, not just for the US economy, but for the global economy. And door number three, and we talk about this a little later in the segment that's coming with Matt, is it's sort of my, not a black swan, but my gray swan, is that Congress grows a pair and says, you know what? The Constitution says we get to control tariffs. So, Mr. Trump, exit stage left. Anything you have 232 justification for right now, we'll keep those on. But everything else, you're going to have to go through Congress if you want all of these things. And we're going to take you to the Supreme Court. And in the meantime, we'll get everything suspended until we can work this out legally. Do you like any of those scenarios? Do you have other scenarios that are on your plate? What do you think happens next now that we are sufficiently liberated?
Well, I think the scenarios 1 and 3 actually reinforce each other because as the noose of constraints tightens like a boa constrictor around President Trump's neck, and that will involve Congress. So just as a couple of things that have happened recently, the Senate has passed a resolution that takes away authority to impose tariffs on Canada. Now, there's a view that that's not going to pass the House. Okay, maybe. Let's see. Um, the second one is that the Senate is now passing actually another resolution, and it's a joint one between a Democratic and a Republican senator. I forgot who they are. Just this was just flashed in news to take away all of the authority, like even further. And by the way, this is April 3rd. 12 hours into our liberty. 12 hours into our newfound sweet tasting liberty from the clutches of the rest of the world that's raped us. And I want to repeat that because President Trump said that. Raped. Right? 12 months after being liberated from rape. 12 hours. We're trying to take back the power, the Congress is trying. So I think that as that news tightens, I think the neo-McKinleyism weakens. The neo-McKinleyism, which is what, there's two basically arguments. There's two lines of thinking in the White House, and I don't think we can pin President Trump on either one of them. One is neo-McKinleyism, represented probably by Commerce Secretary Lutnick and maybe Peter Navarro and so on. And then there's the more of a sort of globalist position, which is represented by everybody else. And it's more like, hey, let's use this to negotiate better deals, fairer deals, in fact, like maybe you actually reduce tariffs and everything. But I think that as that noose of constraints tightens and Congress plays that, I think President Trump will naturally be moved towards the negotiating position. But so I am also, as you, in the base case that this is actually peak uncertainty in a way.
Mm-hmm.
As Secretary of Treasury Scott Bessent said, for those of you not following, he said, before this happened on April 2nd, like, hey guys, this is the ceiling for tariffs. So just like, no, don't panic. Didn't work really that much. Everyone is panicking. But here's what I would say though. Let me play the devil's advocate against our view because there's too much, maybe we're cousins, right? So we have the same kind of. The problem is like you just launched a trade war with everybody else. For those of you who don't know, most trade deals take like 2-3 years to conclude and require and they're usually done 1 to 2 major trade deals at the same time, if none. Like Joe Biden didn't do a single trade deal, just FYI. For everyone who thinks that Donald Trump is like committed to tariffs and being mean, he concluded 2 major trade deals to his credit in the first term.
Yeah, you were saying about Biden. That was actually my biggest whiff in the Biden administration. He technically had fast track authority for the CPTPP for the first, I think it was 7 or 8 months of his presidency, and I thought he might go after it. But he at his core was actually more of a populist when it came to trade.
Because he didn't have any minerals. No, it's not because he's actually populist. It's because he was, I'm trying to choose my language here carefully, but because he did not have the minerals for it. And he didn't want to stand in the way of what the Democratic advisors and consultants in Twitterati have identified as like a move against free trade in America. So great job, Biden administration. Good job. Slow clap. So here we are. I would blame the Biden administration for where we are today. But anyways, let's leave that aside. Let's go back to this point. How do you negotiate with the whole world? Jacob, the USTR, the US Trade Representative Office, has 200 people working for it. The United States of America, no country, forget America, no country in the history of mankind has ever negotiated more than like 3 deals at the same time. So my only concern is like, if these numbers are sixth grade math, and if the intention here is to get quick deals done, then God bless Trump. Like, that's awesome. But if they're looking for a sophisticated like negotiations, are they gonna like recruit people off the street? Like, are you and I gonna be like on the Trump administration trying to get Martinique a good trade deal, even though it's part of France and therefore perhaps the next manufacturing powerhouse as Europe
Well,
moves all its manufacturing off the coast of Canada? Just
I volunteer for the project in Martinique, but maybe Chat GPT.
yeah, maybe. By the way, my bad. Martinique is in the Caribbean. My bad. But like the point
It
is,
is, yes.
yeah. Look, that's the big constraint here. The big constraint I would say is that I don't think there's enough humans in the administration. Not to mention that Doge is potentially going to fire them all. But like, there's not enough humans to really like. So yes, I do think it's negotiations. I think it's number one, and I think your number three scenario, the constraints are going to rise. It's going to
Mhm.
encourage Trump to negotiate. But who's going to do that?
Is there any chance it's like let's say for the sake of argument it is door number 2. Do you think I'm right that it's inflationary spike followed by deflationary spiral into stagflation, or is it something different in your mind?
Well, I mean, I think that we would definitely have a recession. And
Okay.
recessions are usually not inflationary. So the inflationary spike, I think, will be completely irrelevant and almost unnoticeable.
Well, no, but inflation would rise because the cost of imports would rise as a result of the tariffs. Probably if you get a reversion to the mean on energy prices, which have been historically low for the past year, maybe you get some fireworks in the Persian Gulf. Although, I mean, how many times have we said that was going to happen and it didn't do anything to oil? Food prices maybe continuing to rise. Like, I mean, you'd get a situation in which you would get upward pressure on the prices that Americans are paying for things, even as you're getting sort of bad growth information.
Look, I don't think anyone's going to buy a car, right, for the next foreseeable future. And so I just think demand is going to matter more than the price of supply. Your points about food and energy, I mean, those are not really related. Well, food is, but I don't think you can really pin those to tariffs. Either way, I'm not really into tariffs or that inflationary camp.
Mhm.
I think that these levels of tariffs are like, I think the market and consumers are going to look through that inflationary spike, and what's going to matter is that this would be disinflationary, but not because of like some awesome like expansion of supply, not in a positive way. It's funny, Jacob. It's funny. We all know these consumer sentiment and consumer surveys, right? And there's one where like after President Trump got elected, the Democrats think that inflation is going to go
Yeah.
to like 10%. And what was always funny to me was the Republican consumers think inflation is going to go to zero. And
0.
I'm
Yeah.
like, bro, that's the Great Depression. Just FYI, like, if you're pro Trump, you don't, why do you think inflation is going to go zero? So to answer your question, I don't really care to answer your question. Who cares? Because who cares about the next 6, 8 months about inflationary spike? I think the liberal media is going to obsess about that and Trump's like opponents. Like the fact of the matter is that if we go to a recession and prices collapse, like no one's sitting there being like, well, you know what though? Eggs are cheaper. Like you don't have a job. You can barely buy it.
How long does that recession last? If he keep like, let's say that the tariffs that he imposed today are on the books for 12 months. Like, how long does that recession last? Is that the beginning of a Great Depression type thing? Is that, as Vice President Vance and Lutnick and all those guys are trying to tell us, is it the medicine that we're taking to get to greener pastures after the fact? Like, how long, if we get to door number 2, do you think this is going to last?
I don't know. I don't know. Difficult to say. I do think the US would just I mean, one thing that they are correct about is that the market and the economy would adjust to a new reality and we would move on. The problem is that what does that new reality look like on the other side of the adjustment? And I don't think it's a cornucopia of a golden age of America. And part of the reason is that these tariffs were not applied intelligently. Like, again, there is absolutely nothing wrong with being mean to the rest of the world, of course. And it is nothing wrong in telling Europe, you don't get to put 10% tariff on the cars. Come on. But they didn't do that. You know why? Because there's 200 people in USTR and they said, fuck it. Let's just do this nonsense math because it's easier. Because it's really difficult to go through 100 countries on the planet, obviously not all, but let's say 100 major economies and go line by line. Like, where is their unfairness? They didn't do that. So instead, they just applied these blanket tariffs. And the reason that is not an optimal outcome for America, and this is like, I can't believe that this is even contentious, is because if we start making our own bicycles in the United States of America, like that's not a good outcome. It's not. Listen, it's not, because whoever is making that bicycle is going to make it at 20 bucks an hour and they're not going to be able to afford that bicycle. Like that's the point. Like, again, yes, use tariffs. And by the way, here's what I would say. Let's say you're a Republican or you're a Trump supporter and you believe tariffs are good. Again, we can support that view, right? We can say tariffs are good to protect a certain industry, tariffs are good to address unfair trade, and tariffs are good to punish people, right? We all agree. Okay, fine. But here's what I would say to you. I think that this way of using tariffs could actually backfire. We could swim out on the other side of this administration with a sort of a really sour taste in the mouth of using tariffs ever again.
Mhm.
I think that Trump has done a service to tariffs as a tool because of how unthoughtful their application was.
Yeah, you would have thought that Smoot Hawley accomplished that, but maybe not. Okay, look, we've got 10 minutes left maximum, um, and I want to at least squeeze one thing in that wasn't related to the tariffs that happened in the world this week. Um, and you probably saw this on Tuesday. China launched a major military exercise, sending warships and fighter planes to sort of pretend like they were blockade or to rehearse a blockade of Taiwan in the future. They did it because Taiwan's president called China a foreign hostile force, and the Chinese were very mad about that. We haven't touched Taiwan at all on the Cousins podcast at all. But before Liberation Day, this is what everybody was worried about. We were talking World War III, South China Sea once again. You want to take the wheel here for a second, or would you like me to get on my
No,
soapbox?
go ahead. I mean, it's something you identified, so please.
I just, it made me stop for a second because it was a fairly sophisticated military exercise, and it absolutely is trying to show that they are planning for a future in which they could credibly threaten to blockade Taiwan. My point is just that future is probably 10 years out. It's
Mm.
not happening anytime soon. It would be self-defeating. Maybe by the way, I'm wrong about this. Maybe China is reading the actions of the Trump administration and saying, you know what? Like the United States is weakening itself. It's showing its allies that they can't depend on the United States. Maybe we should just take Taiwan now. I just don't think that they have the ships and the planes and the soldiers to actually accomplish it. And I think they're going to try to do what they did to Hong Kong to Taiwan in general. And so I've always looked at a side eye with these reports that try and get a few more clicks because war is happening in the South China Sea. But maybe I'm being too blasé. Do you want to take the other side of that, or are we cousins in this one too?
Well, this is why we're cousins. Sometimes I worry that we're always going to kind of be on the same page. So, um, like, I mean, I agree with everything you said, right? So I don't want to add to it with just more sanguine verbiage. So instead, what I'm going to do is take the other side. Just you know, um, United States of America has decided. Let's say this is not negotiations, right? This is like neo McKinleyism. Um, like you know, if you're China, this is as good of a moment as ever to reunite with your wayward province. The biggest constraint to China, forget military, forget all this other stuff, economy. The biggest constraint to reuniting with Taiwan through military force is that China really likes the multipolar world. It doesn't want to unite the rest of the world against China. And Americans will be proven correct. If China invades Taiwan, they can then point to the rest of the world and say, you see, we told you so. They're up to no good. You guys all thought they weren't that big of a deal, but they are. But if the United States of America is already doing the job of splitting up the world, and if it's attacking its allies, this is your moment, April 3rd, 2025. Like, this is the moment. Because if there's ever a lack of reaction from Europe or Canada, um, this would be it. It would be in this moment where the West is divided. And that's all I would say. I would just say that, like, and by the way, there were many, many smart people who were working in Washington, DC, who said that that moment for China was actually 12 months after Russia invaded Ukraine. There was all that nonsense, like the
Yep.
world is out of javelins, so like this is the moment. Even though why would Chinese use tanks in Taiwan, for God's sakes? But like really smart people, like literally people working in the Trump administration in really high positions. I was present in their presence when they were like, "Listen, man, China's going to Taiwan because we don't have enough javelins in stock." And I'm like, "Okay, bro, all right." Anyways, look. Let's leave that aside. Let's leave that aside. Um, I'm sick and tired of these windows of opportunities for China.
Yeah.
So if they didn't take the javelin like shortage as a window, and they don't take it now, then they're not going to invade Taiwan, for God's sakes. So here we go. You want the window of opportunity for China? It's right now. Right now, the West is in disarray. Everyone's at each other's throats. President Trump has identified Europe as effectively as much of an enemy as Russia. You know,
Yeah.
and by the way,
And
vice
and and
versa.
and and 2 aircraft carriers on their way to the Middle East to deal with Iran,
Literally,
so it won't be
yes.
there to deal.
Yeah, and I mean, like, by the way, Friedrich Merz, the new chancellor of Germany, basically said the same thing. America, Russia, what's the difference, right? So, like, everything is in disarray. If there was ever a window of opportunity for China to invade, to military to reunite with its wayward province, this would be it. And so if they don't, man, I'm kind of sick of it, and I don't want to talk about it anymore.
I think that if I were Xi Jinping, I would get a copy of the tariffs that Trump showed off at the Rose Garden, and I would highlight the rates that the United States has set on Taiwan, and I would put in a little letter. We see the barbarians are trying to impose this barbarian tool called tariffs on you. As soon as you reunite with your homeland, 0% tariffs for Taiwan into the Chinese market because you'll be part of the market. Don't you want access to the Chinese market? We will welcome you with open arms. And maybe we'll even drop in X amount of money per capita for every single head in Taiwan to make the
Yeah.
transition a little bit easier. XOXO, Xi, give me a call.
Wait, who's used the argument that there would be no tariffs if you just join our country? I feel like that's already been used over the last couple of weeks.
Has it?
Yeah, Canada.
Yeah, I know.
All
But
right.
I
Well,
think you're exactly right. I think expect more integration between these different markets that are going to come closer together, and that the real threat that China poses to Taiwan is not with the military drills. It's that the more the United States pushes on its economic relationship with Taiwan, the more that Taiwan's leaders have to become realistic and say, "Hey, the U.S. is not here for us, and Japan's not going to be able to stop the Chinese forever. Why don't we make a deal now when we have maximum leverage and try and get 30 years of one country, two systems or something like that? Like that's the danger that's lurking."
but this goes back to your awesome point at the beginning that we didn't even spend enough time on. You were talking about Israel having done all this work ahead of this.
Hmm.
Vietnam did too. They get slapped, and
Yep.
Israel's like, "Whoa, bro! Like, what's up?" Same with like, think about TSMC. TSMC committed itself to 100 billion more of investment in the United States of America, which weakens Taiwan significantly from a critical security perspective because they're moving all this sophisticated production out of Taiwan. It launched a huge, serious political debate inside Taipei. Similarly, you had Japan do the same thing, right? They were the first to come in with a ton of FDI, and none of them got rewarded by the Trump administration. Not Israel for what you said, not Vietnam for similar to what you said about Israel, not Taiwan, not Japan. And I think they just didn't have time. 200 people at USTR trying to publish a 350-page report on this, trying to apply these tariffs. I wouldn't read into that, Jacob. I think it's too early,
Hmm.
but again, it does send a message to the rest of the world like, well, if you don't want our FDI, if that doesn't lessen the impact of tariffs, then like we're not going to put FDI into the United States. And so again, to the MAGA supporters who say this is going to be awesome, like no, it's only going to be awesome if Jacob and I are nerds, okay? Which we are. We don't understand how to sell anything because we've never sold anything in our lives. I get that. I concede that. Okay. What we need is smart salespeople to sell us because they're cool and they don't know how to pick up the opposite sex at the bar or the same, whatever. My point is, we don't, right? We're nerds. So we're all sitting here balking at this number. but actually it leads to negotiations. And then Trump sits down and says, hey, man, listen, thanks for that FDI. We actually do care about that. We will lower your tariff, right? And then Europe is like, okay, let's build some more factories for cars. So that is my base case scenario. I know we're at the end of the hour. We got to end. I would agree with you, Jacob. I would. I just think that they need to rush towards that ASAP. That's got to be moved quickly.
I agree with you there. All right, we have to run. As soon as you hear the end of this, our segment with Matt, which was recorded yesterday on April 2nd, will come out. And I think we're going to push this out today, if not first thing tomorrow, because we don't want to sit on it. So enjoy y'all's emergency podcast. And if you meant what you said, if you want emergency podcasts from us, uh, get like, they don't even have to listen to it. Rate it, comment, review, like that all helps the algorithm. So thank you very much, and we'll talk to you later. Yeah, is that good salesmanship? Yeah, I think so. Maybe, right?
I mean, it kind of sounds desperate, sounding like nerds again.
All right. Cheers, man. All right. For the first time on the podcast, we're going to have 3 people. We're going to try how it is. I thought, I don't know, is Matt our second cousin, Marko? Is he also a first cousin? I don't know how to work it. I also couldn't help but think of the 3 Musketeers. And then I was thinking, which of the Musketeers are each of us? Marko, you're obviously Porthos. There's not much intrigue there. But I don't know who is Aramis, and I don't know who is Athos between me and Matt. Maybe we should pick up the conversation there.
I mean, it's been way too long since I've read the abridged version of the 3 Musketeers.
Oh man. Okay. Well, that's homework then, because I couldn't figure out. Well, would you describe yourself more as sarcastic and clever but religious, or as sort of taciturn, deeply emotional with a mysterious past? Which one of those feels more correct?
Definitely mysterious, taciturn.
Yeah, I'm going to let you guys judge on that one. Maybe we should see how this goes, and then we'll find out.
Listen,
okay.
all I want to say is, Jacob, you've now said that I would be played in movies by Oliver Platt and Shane Gillis, and I feel like this is not fair. Okay, I think I can do better than this. I think that I can do better. In fact, many people, including my mom, have said that I look like Jim Halpert. Okay, from The Office. I just want to John Krasinski, who has been called by People magazine the sexiest man alive in 2025. So I'm just gonna put that out there. But you have me typecast as Shane Gillis and Oliver Platt, so
Okay, Porthos, calm down. And I would be young Gene Hackman would play me, like in the French Connection. Go look at a picture of Gene Hackman.
Yeah,
Connection.
That's actually that's fair, Jacob. That's fair, and that's such a pimp like mystique right there. Is Gene Hackman in the French Connection?
One of the greatest scenes ever is when he walks into that bar in Mississippi. Right, in Mississippi Burning. That's one of the greatest scenes in American cinema, and grabs that racist cop by the testicles. Well, anyways, if you don't know what that is from, this is.
Well, while we're at it though, guys, we ought to pay our respects to Val Kilmer.
Yes,
who was truly one of the greats, and of course, Doc Holliday in Tombstone, one of the immortal Hollywood roles.
I could be your Huckleberry.
Yeah. All right. Enough nonsense. So, Matt, I'm supposed to set you up for, I don't know exactly what your hot take is, but Marko tells me you have a hot take. So what's on your mind?
Well, I don't know if it's a hot take. I've been reading so much garbage about Trump staying on for a 3rd term. And in a way, it's something that I sort of feel qualified to talk about just because I followed so closely the whole process by which Xi Jinping removed what were very nascent and very fragile, informal term limits in China. And it really wasn't that difficult for Xi Jinping in retrospect. And it was pretty well known that he was going to be able to stay beyond the 10 years. But also, I mean, I'm sure you guys remember covering when Vladimir Putin sort of handed off the baton to Dmitry Medvedev and then ended up coming back. So the way that it works in the U.S. is that there's a, I guess you could say, a legitimate constitutional debate about the 22nd Amendment, because what it says is that a president cannot be elected more than 2 times. But that then raises this supposed loophole where the president could serve more than 2 times. And specifically, the idea is that he could run as the vice president, and then the elected president would step down, and then he would accede to the presidency so he could serve a third term without having been elected to a third term. But I find that to be just a very specious argument. First of all, we should clear the air by saying, FDR served and was elected for 4 terms. Well, I
Mhm.
guess he was elected for 4, and he served part of the 4th term. So it's not as if this is total heresy. If the law allowed it, if the public opinion elected Trump to a third term and it was legal, then that would be a democratic outcome. So we have to acknowledge that. But when FDR did it, there wasn't a 22nd Amendment. And the spirit of the 22nd Amendment is very clear. And we know that not just by saying the spirit. We know that because what it says is that the exception is if someone has served 2 years or more as as a president where they were not elected, so meaning a vice president who takes power because the president steps down or is assassinated or something, they if they've served more than 2 years in that function, then they cannot be elected twice. So in other words, you could serve exactly 2 years and you could be elected twice, so that the statutory or the constitutional limit is 10 years. It
Mhm.
doesn't have any provision for what if you've already served 2 terms, could you be the vice president and then serve an additional 2 years? But think about how silly it would be for Americans to elect someone knowing that the president would immediately step down, there would be a switcheroo, and then the VP, could serve for 2 years as the president, and then he'd be disqualified. So, bottom line, it's silly, but it's also probably not constitutional because the 12th Amendment says that the vice president has to be eligible for election to the presidency. And if you've already been elected 2 terms, you're not eligible to be elected president. So I think the 12th Amendment controls the 22nd Amendment. And my long way of my reason for going through all this is just to say, so where does that leave us with the Trump administration? Well, first of all, the US still has institutions and they're not completely eviscerated yet. I mean, I think that's overrated. Second of all, public opinion is not just going to um, it's very strange to think that Trump's highest popular opinion rating ever is the 49% of the vote that he got in 2024, and yet we're supposed to believe that the public is just going to move mountains to get him reelected, even though he'll be 83 years old. And we know the public doesn't like switcheroos, given what happened with Biden and Harris. But then, lastly, that means that Trump has to get anything that he wants to get done. He has to get it done in the 4-year period. And so that taps into this whole discussion about, uh, whether Trump is going to just go berserk or be a loose cannon with regard to tariffs because he only has 1 term to get it all done. And that's not exactly my view, but anyway, that's what it taps into is if you are term limited, then you'd better get things done while you can. And that's one interpretation, but I would point out, and I'll conclude, that Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, our evidence is that when people overstay their welcome, when they stay for extended periods, if anything, that's when they're more likely to become a loose cannon or an ideologue, meaning pursue their policy regardless of the consequences.
Mhm. Um, well, the reason that it's come up yet again here is because he gave an interview with NBC News, and I'll quote him here. He said, "I'm not joking about a third term. A lot of people want me to do it, and there are methods which you could do it." And then he also said, "But it's very early in my administration, blah, blah, blah." So he's been out there saying this. And I sort of take your point, although, the definition of a constitutional crisis would be if the Republicans nominated him and if he got elected again, and if he won technically an election, even if it wasn't constitutional, and they just said, screw it, like we're the incumbent power, like we don't recognize this, we're just going to install ourselves then. And then who's going to be the one who arrests him or takes him away? Like he tried in the 2020 election to get Vice President Pence at the time to certify things that weren't technically certifiable, and like it wasn't like it was a layup there. Like you had to have a couple of people say no, and theoretically over the next couple of years they're going to stack the deck and put loyalists in and everything else. But I'm mostly playing devil's advocate there. I tend to agree with you, but
I would just say I'm not saying it's unthinkable. I'm not saying, that this is a taboo and we shouldn't discuss the topic. I'm just saying that it seems highly improbable. And specifically, I think the Supreme Court will rule when asked. So if he's nominated, someone will sue and they will be asked. I think what they will conclude is that the 12th Amendment controls the 22nd Amendment, which is that, in other words, if you're not eligible to be president, you're not eligible to be vice president.
So that's interesting. Can I ask some kind of rapid fire questions here? First of all, Matt, would you like why did we ban having multiple terms? Like, let's just ask a stupid question, right?
Yep.
Because like FDR is not considered a bad president,
No.
right? So like that worked out, I guess. So why then did we decide after FDR? Why did the U.S. decide that was not a good thing?
So George Washington established a Republican tradition that we're ruled by gentlemen farmers rather than kings or dictators. So, in other words, they take a turn at the helm, and then, like Cato of Utica, they retire to their farm. And they have served the Republic, but they are not, but they have the integrity to turn away power when they've served. And so it is drawn up with the whole notion that integrity, like virtue, is necessary to a republic, and the American ideology believes that. And all presidents adhered to this except FDR, and of course his detractors hated him for running a third term, but they were outnumbered, and it was an extraordinary time. And so afterwards, actually, the 22nd Amendment passed pretty quickly because people said, we don't want to, that was remarkable. FDR pulled it off. And no, he did not destroy the Republic in the pursuit of absolute power. But for future reference, let's go back to let's codify the Washington norm.
I don't know. I mean, I think President Trump would say he's pretty remarkable. I think
Let's
he would
not,
also say that it's a pretty profound time right now too. I mean, with, liberation from the clutches of evil Europeans and Danes. So, like
well, but Marco, that's the point, is that they passed the constitutional amendment, right? So like Trump is in a new context. He could make that claim. And remember, FDR's approval rating was 70%, not 49%. But um, but Trump can make every
Matt,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, quoting facts. That's not why we brought you here. We brought you here actually so that you can quote, Cato the Younger, Cato of Utica. Like, I just want to pause here for a second, turn the TikTok camera on,
oh,
Jacob.
turn
Like,
on.
this is who Matt Gertken is. All right, he will weave Cato of Utica seamlessly into clearly a podcast run by Muppets, which is
Well,
Jacob.
but I hope I'm right. Now that you call attention, I'm not sure whether it was Cato the Younger or the Elder who retired to his farm.
Oh no,
So
Now we're
we're just
getting hate
dropping
mail.
Latin names without being 100%
Let's
sure.
make sure
Uh-oh.
we don't include this. I don't want hate mail from classics professors. That hate mail will never stop. It will
Oh,
go
I
on
want it.
forever.
Oh, we're definitely including it. Did you guys see the schedule of events for Liberation Day? What did you see? What is planned after the Rose Garden address? Did you see this?
no,
At
is
8
Kid Rock?
p.m. Eastern, there's a quote: "Global markets respond as the impact of America's renewed strength takes hold." End quote.
So, they're gonna watch
I'm not kidding.
CNBC
I'm
Asia.
not kidding. That's not April Fool's. Like
Are they
that's
gonna watch
in
like
the
like CNBC Asia is gonna be on a big screen TV in the yard of the White House? Like
yeah.
on like
It,
projected. Like they're gonna
it,
watch.
it'll it'll be like Obama watching the Osama bin Laden assassination, except it'll be them with McDonald or with beef tallowed Shake Shack fries or something like that, watching how the
Watch
markets will just be ascending.
watch Asian markets rally, and then they're just confused.
Or, or
It's like,
or maybe that's how Besant had it planned, Marco, is that he knew that by the time we actually announced this whole thing, that you're going to get this great rally, and that's why they put it into the program.
maybe. Yeah, so they win either way. This is beautiful, which is why he probably deserves a third term. I mean, I'm just saying, like.
Well, and he also very smartly, I don't know if you saw this. So we're recording on Wednesday, April 2nd. This will come out a few days later. But markets are levitating right this second because he leaked to Politico that maybe he was reconsidering Elon Musk's position in the administration. And markets really like the idea that Elon Musk is going to have to take a step back. So maybe he's going to try and combine that together with something else and
Also,
go from there.
yeah, there were also two other things. I mean, Besant spoke to lawmakers, quote unquote, which was a euphemism for was trying to douse the flames of an absolute mutiny in the House of Representatives by saying that this is the worst, that April, 2nd is going to be, setting the baseline for negotiations. And then there was also another leak in Politico, I think, Jacob, that I think is almost more important for the markets, which is that Howard Lutnick is going to get the knives are out basically if this all turns into a recession and sort of bad things. But going back, to the subject at hand. And just by the way, we never really introduced Matt, Jacob. I feel like we weren't very good hosts.
Well, don't worry, I'll introduce him at the very beginning. But if Matt wants to say,
yeah, you can have like an AI voiceover read my official biography.
Well, I just think that it's funny. We all started career at the same place in Stratford. Matt and I actually started on the very same day, Jacob. We're a little bit older than you.
You are, yeah.
Yeah, even though you look like Gene Hackman from Mississippi Burning. But anyways, like, I'm just joking.
Or Hoosiers, or French Connection, or any of these other ones.
French Connection, he was very, very good looking. So what I would say is, so we actually started on the same day wearing the same silly polo shirt. And our boss, George Friedman, made fun of us on that day for basically dressing like dweebs. But I've known basically Matt probably longer than I know almost any other human out there, other than members of family. And he knows how to weave politics and geopolitics and markets. And he works at the same firm as I do, BCA Research, and provides investors with very, very timely and excellent analysis on geopolitics and how that matters for the markets. So the question then is, we've got this third term debate. How would you say, like, how does it matter, Matt? Like, let's leave the sort of, the hysterics aside, right? Like, of, whether this is the end of American democracy. But how would it actually matter from a perspective of like economy, other countries, markets? Like, what do you think? Is there a relevance to this, or is it more relevant, more related to whether Trump is popular or not at the time?
Chinese stocks, if we compare their performance to emerging markets, it wasn't like investors fled when Xi Jinping stayed on for a third term. That really happened when he cracked down on the tech sector. And so in other words, when he showed his true colors as more of a neo-Maoist and more of a hostile leader toward oligarchs and like the idea of private technological innovation that would be independent of the Communist Party, that's when the market really got frightened. I mean, I think he compounded the issue by staying on for a third term and having his predecessor unceremoniously dragged out of the Central Committee meeting in 2022. But it seems as if the market was really more concerned about how he treated the tech sector than whether he stayed for a third term. And then I looked at Russian equities for what it's worth, and on a relative basis to emerging markets, there actually was a little bit of a bounce, you could say, under Medvedev.
Right, that's true.
But then, of course, it all came crumbling down. So the point is,
Yep.
for me, the takeaway is that if these guys overstay their welcome and they pursue absolute power, that what they do is they remove the potential for smooth transitions in the future, and they also they make it more difficult to correct policy under their own term. And in both cases, the market should, and long-term investors should view that as a bad thing. You don't have the correction mechanisms, and you may not have smooth transition of power in the future.
Sorry to interject, Jacob. I just want to say one more thing. It was interesting about Russia that you mentioned. Under Medvedev, yeah, it was fine. But then remember that press conference full of cynicism between Medvedev and Putin when they were on stage together, where they kind of made the handover back to Putin?
Mm-hmm.
The market never really recovered from that point. I mean, went up and down, but like that was kind of like the market didn't like that handover back because it was kind of, okay, we now know what Russia is. But let me again be a devil's advocate here. France, okay, we had this Marine Le Pen, judgment in France, Matt, which I know you're obviously following very closely, and you know a lot about this. France has this tradition of almost going after every president. I don't remember the last president of France that wasn't accused of anything. Um, this is true. I mean, they've all gone through investigations and lawfare as it's referred to. I think Francois Hollande may not have been, but that's also because he was quite uninspiring. And almost to be a good French president, you have to make people angry. So in other words, can we say that what's happening in America, like, is it really comparable to Russia or China, or is it actually more comparable to some of the other DMs that have this sort of constant back and forth? I mean, every transition in France is rocked by some lawfare afterwards. We have whole institutions torn apart and rebuilt, particularly in the intelligence services. For example, domestic intelligence services are almost always reformed by every president for obvious reasons. Um, in other words, I mean, I'm not saying it's an optimal outcome, but is it a tragic one for American democracy?
Yeah, I mean, but you're saying, is it a tragic one for American democracy if he actually did stay for a third term?
I mean, I guess if he pursued it, I'm not saying he wins.
Yeah,
I'm just saying, like, let's say President Trump really wants this and ends up running as the vice president.
yeah,
Uh, you know what I mean? Like, and then there's a constant, like, he leave. Basically, we're now in a world where effectively, I think Americans should expect after every presidential term, there to be some legal outcomes out of it. I think that's the world we're in. And
right.
I'm just saying, like, that has been the case in France for the last, I think, 40 years.
So, so that's fair. And another example, not quite like it's not as applicable as France, but for example, I know you all know that South Korea, I think almost every president in modern memory has been imprisoned. One of them committed suicide. Um, so, but they're, I guess, technically an emerging market. Anyway, I think the point stands. But France is on its fifth republic. The United States is really on its first, or maybe you could argue second. But the idea is that America has the longest running constitution continuously, and sets itself up as a model of constitutional government and rule of law, not rule of men, or not rule by law. And so that can be disrupted, and that would be the normal course of history. But it is sort of sad. I mean, personally, I think it will introduce more disruptions and more political difficulties rather than less. And so I think it's a chapter, and it's one where basically what we're witnessing is the American Republic is maturing, and it's becoming more like other republics, and there's a lot of room for debate whether it will approach the sort of Latin American direction more rapidly, or whether it'll just be more like France or a European government. But anyway, none of us can pretend that European governments haven't had multiple revolutions, and I think that's a fair point. And the issue though that I think Jacob pointed to, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, Jacob, but is that in the short term, in our own lives, in the coming few years, it will be a really big deal if Trump actually pursues this, uh, because it will set up a clash. My own view is that the institutions are much stronger than people think, and the reason for that isn't because of them per se. It's because the institutions still have a lot of popular opinion behind them, so that I think he would get shut down. I think the Supreme Court would shut him down, and the majority of popular opinion would really turn away from a third term. But obviously, that is an assessment. I mean, that could be wrong.
Yeah, I want to shout out Ted Lowy, former Cornell professor. I think he passed away 10 years ago, who actually said, I think we're on the third republic, I believe was what he said. I at least slept through my way through some of his freshman lectures when he was still alive. And he had a pretty good argument for it. If you haven't read Ted Lowy, he's a good one. He makes a provocative argument. But Marco, I think the answer to your question is entirely how it happens. if it happens like it did after Roosevelt, which is you get 2/3 approval from the Senate and the House of Representatives that somebody can serve for a third term, it's not a tragedy at all. That's democracy at work. If it is some kind of nefarious, like he's going to be the vice president, and then the president's going to step down, or we're going to force him through with some other thing, and it's through like extra constitutional means that they somehow ensconce him there, then it is completely a tragedy, and it's the end of American democracy. It's hard to imagine that you're going to get the Senate and the House to give 2/3 approval. Like if you go back to when they instituted term limits after Roosevelt left. I mean, Roosevelt had basically led the country through World War II. He had led the country through the Great Depression, and there were also members of his own party who didn't like the precedent that he had set. That went back to the Washington precedent that Matt talked about, and said like we should probably ensconce this. And so they peeled off something like I think 50 Democrats in the House to vote with the Republicans in instituting term limits. You can't really imagine the same sort of thing happening today. I don't think you could get something through the House or the Senate where you would get a constitutional amendment to extend term limits. Maybe here's out there, unless the Democrats looked at the board and said, you know what, we think Obama could win, so fine. Let's go for third term limits. Let's have a constitutional amendment to change the 22nd Amendment, and let's go Obama Trump and go for it.
That's a really good point. That's a really good point.
Whoa. You stole all my thunder. I was thinking that. This is where I was going. This is where I wanted to go. I want to go right here.
Go.
Look, what did Trump say at the end of the Zelensky blow up? He you would have
good
thought
TV.
Good TV, baby. He looked. I love this. This is. I love when people stay true to themselves. I really do. Like this is one of my like joys when people stay true to themselves, right? Like when Jacob hits a turnaround jumper like Joe Johnson, like I love it, even though he like makes me feel like stupid and like weak. It's beautiful. It's beautiful, right? Or like when Matt Gertken drops like Cato of Utica, like this is like Matt becoming who he is. What I loved about Trump is that here's the moment. He gets really angry at Zelensky. J.D. Vance is losing his mind. Neck vein is popping because he's serious. And then everyone's mad. Everyone's freaking out. And then Trump looks at the end to the assembled media and says, with a smirk on his face, that was good television, wasn't it? So let's be honest here, gentlemen. This is what America wants, right? Trump and Obama have been circling each other like two boxers who haven't found a date. Wait, Matt. Wait.
No.
Wait. This is because you love your country too much, Matt. Jacob and I, we love the spectacle. So
I don't know, guys.
Listen. Can I just play you guys one clip?
Go.
This is recent. I believe this is recent. So I want to just play this. And we will obviously splice it so it's nice. But this is Obama talking. Listen to this.
And the reason some people think, wow, I don't know, I remember that economy when he first came in being pretty good. Yeah, it was pretty good, because it was my economy. We had 75 straight months of job growth that I handed over to him. It wasn't something he did. I had spent 8 years cleaning up the mess that the Republicans had left me the last time. So just in case everybody has a hazy memory, he didn't do nothing except those big tax cuts.
So anyways, my point is, this clip sounds like Obama's ready.
Yeah. But to me, you guys are making the ultimate point, because this is exactly why the Republicans aren't going to entertain this notion of tampering with term limits. What they, I think, will realize, it's difficult for Republicans in the modern era to win popular majorities. And even though Trump did win a popular majority, it was actually a plurality, right? And what I'm saying is, I think they're aware that if it's just a popularity contest for the presidency, it can be very bad for them. And so I think
Barack Obama is 65.
Yeah,
and 28.
So I mean, this is This is a very local and very topical reason to say that there just will not be any movement to actually make this happen because Republicans would recognize it's bad for them. But even if Obama weren't so charismatic, or even if we separated the issues here, I still would point out you need 3/4 of the states as well, not just,
Yep.
this is just not going to happen. So the only way to do it is through an interpretation of the 22nd Amendment. And I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not going to pretend that I can, pronounce on this, but the Supreme Court, I just would be amazed if the Supreme Court, including a Supreme Court with a conservative leaning, I would be amazed if they interpreted an amendment, the 22nd Amendment, which was intended to limit the terms as allowing a longer term. That's just implicitly nonsensical and very counter to the spirit of the amendment and the debate. And I'm sure they'll pull out the text from the debates of framing the amendment, and they'll find out that the only reason it didn't say that you can't serve, more than 2 terms is because if you were president and then later you ended up being Speaker of the House and 2 people died or something, you would end up being president again. But then all that does is it forces Congress to set a new election. Congress would have to vote on the new president, and then you'd have an election at the next term. The next 4-year term.
Wait, so what do you mean by that?
Well, no, I want to interject because I think the idea that like that you're going to get 2/3 from the Senate and the House, that you're going to peel the Democrats off and get an Obama thing like that's pretty pie in the sky out there. But I want to play devil's advocate with you, Matt, because I don't trust the institutional resilience of the United States maybe necessarily as much as you do, because a lot can happen between now and then with the Supreme Court. What if 2 current justices retire or slip on banana peels and Trump gets to appoint 2 more justices on the court versus what he's already done? Could he pack the court in such a way that they would look favorably on such a thing? Or what if you had a scenario where some states wrote Trump in on the ballot or decided that Trump was going to be there and wanted to have him as the president, even if he ran against some kind of Democrat in the next election? Could you have states that were saying, no, Trump is our legitimate president? And then would you have a new sitting president, like deploy the U.S. Army to enforce the election results? Like the definition of a constitutional crisis is that, somebody, like, it's not just because the Constitution says something can't happen doesn't mean it's not going to happen. It's when the thing happens, where is the enforcement mechanism? Who is like Abraham Lincoln in 1861? Who is suspending habeas corpus and saying no? Like, here are federal soldiers to enforce what I think the Constitution means, even if I'm not on firm ground with all those sorts of things. Like, you can imagine pie in the sky out there scenarios where maybe he gets in, and I think that's the big. Like that I think is the chip at U.S. institutions. If we'd been talking a year ago, and we would have said a 3rd possible term, I don't want to speak for both of you. I would have said, oh, bullshit. There's no way anybody's going to get a 3rd term. Like, that's locked in stone. And here on April 2nd, I think I'm 85% of the way there with you, Matt. But like 10% of my brain is like, well, could he? Could things happen in such a way that it would go that direction? Like, it's not nonsensical. And then we start comparing the United States to China and Russia and France and South Korea, and we're very quickly down the slippery slope. So I don't know. Just a little devil's advocate.
Well, just I'll give a stab at an answer, but I'll be short. It is the U.S. military, and that's the part that's uncomfortable. I completely agree that it would be a constitutional crisis. And for the record, I am not arguing I think we'll have various constitutional crises. But the military swears its allegiance to the Constitution. And the Constitution says that presidents are elected and that they can't be elected more than twice. And so unless the Supreme Court does rule in his favor or the law changes, then I think it would be ultimately the armed forces that would enforce it. Now, you can definitely call that a crisis, because if it is the U.S. military that has to like haul him out of the Oval Office on January 20th, 2029, it still sets up a new world. It still creates a new version of the American Republic in which the military has become effectively the arbiter, and we no longer have an implicit military backing of civilian power. Instead, we might have a more active military intervention in civilian power. So I recognize all that. I'm just saying, I don't think he can do it unless the Supreme Court rules in his favor or um, or the law itself has changed, and I don't think he can get enough states to change the law.
Well, and also the Supreme Court, I mean, one of the forecasts that Matt made, I think like 12 years ago, was that the Supreme Court would eventually turn against Trump in many ways.
I've definitely been hammering that. I'm not sure when I first wrote that, but
A long time ago.
here's an example, guys, with that special prosecutor that Trump tried to fire in this term. Um, Chief Justice John Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett both shifted and voted with the liberals, delivering a 5-4 majority against the president. Now, that prosecutor then just withdrew himself from the whole controversy to avoid having it go all the way to a final verdict. But that was a shot across the bow for President Trump. And I think here's the key thing, which you know, and it would require him appointing different people, because even though there's a conservative leaning, there is a sleight of hand that the media does with that conservative leaning on the Supreme Court. They're not all Trumpists. These people are some of the best jurists in the American system. They got their way up there through pretty conventional means. And so it's basically like, Thomas and Alito, I guess you can sort of debate about, but I don't think there's really much reason to think that Barrett or Gorsuch are going to be Trump's lackeys. We know Roberts won't be, and I guess Kavanaugh might become the swing player in some of those situations. But I'm just saying, these guys, some of them are fairly strict constructionists, and they actually don't love the idea of an imperial presidency. And guess what? They have a lifetime term.
Yeah. Well, I think one thing to point out, because we've talked about the sexy stuff. I think the other thing that's happening here, and I want to call in. I'm sure you guys saw the Cory Booker 25-hour like speech or whatever he did. Hats off to him. I don't know how he's standing for 25 hours, but I think one of the things that Trump has done so well is that he keeps himself in the media cycle at all times. And this third term nonsense it's the perfect Trump cocktail. It's like he's got every single headline is talking about it. Every single newspaper, liberal, conservative, international, domestic, like everybody is covering this thing. And it's just more and more Trump in front of them. And I think like Cory Booker's grandstanding in the Senate didn't actually do anything. Like he didn't stop a bill from being passed or anything like that. But I think his instinct is correct. I think the Democrats, like if there's going to be a viable opposition to the media machine that President Trump has built, you have to steal the limelight away. And you can't steal the limelight away with sober discussion of the Supreme Court or of the principles of balance of powers and republicanism and things like that. You need the headlines. You need every single newspaper to be like, did you see Cory Booker up there for 25 hours? Even if they're making fun of him, and they are making fun of him on the conservative channels, like he dominated the news cycle for 25 hours and gummed up the works of the Senate. And I think if the opposition can get there, maybe you can take some of the limelight away from him. I think that like leads to a very weird like information environment. Like where are you actually getting information and what matters? Because the media is going to sell you like the click stuff, and what's actually happening is happening behind closed doors or is not actually being reported on. But to me, that was actually maybe the bigger signal from the third term thing, because I think we're seeing the one grand strategy that Trump has is his manipulation of the media, and he's an expert at it. He got the Three Musketeers on here to debate the constitutional intricacies of a third term, so we're talking about him too. Like he's doing exactly what he wants.
It's very hard to have a conversation without Trump these days. That's true. But look, he will be removed though, right? By old age. I mean, he's just going to become unsightly. He's going to, within a few years, he's going to be limping around haggardly, shaking. Everyone's going to be appalled because no one likes death. Nobody likes a memento mori every day when they look at the TV screen. So this is just inherently limited. And, so was FDR. And the amazing thing is that the damage that one person can do when they have the powers of the presidency is pretty extensive. So I'm not just brushing it all off, but I am saying that to have this conversation in Trump's honeymoon period is flawed. It basically 6 months from now, we're all going to see that he's vulnerable, extremely vulnerable.
It may be flawed, but it's provocative and it gets the people going.
Yeah.
And that is why we're here. But like I do want to say one thing. I think Cory Booker's speech, fine. I think Jacob, what you were saying, is you got to do it for the gram in today's world. Like that's the world we're in. Trump knows how this is done, clearly.
Mhm.
And I think the problem is that when the Democrats do it with people who are not authentic, it comes off really bad, you know? So you can't do it for the gram unless you're authentic, unless you wear your true self on your sleeve. And Obama was authentic. Like he just was. He's a charismatic dude who's authentic. Like he is who he is, I don't think that the Democrats have really found that person. I don't think
Oh,
it's
they found him. He just wasn't allowed to win the nomination. His name was Bernie Sanders, and he probably would have wiped the floor with Trump in 2016. I still stand by that.
Well, someone's going to emerge. Someone always does. What would really be great for the Democrats would be a military veteran. All you have to do is get sort of a blue collar dude who's a JD Vance, but he's a Democrat and fought in the wars, and the whole conversation will change. As long as he hasn't learned to adopt all these abstruse language games that the Democrats are always playing in the universities and then injecting into public discourse.
Well, it's funny you say that. I would have thought Mark Kelly was the guy, but you probably remember a couple weeks ago, Elon Musk tweeted that, or X'd, or whatever we're supposed to call it now, that Mark Kelly was a traitor, even though he's a veteran and like served in all these different things. But like nobody went after Elon for that. Nobody, like none of the folks that are supporting Trump like got off the Trump train because Elon Musk is out there insulting veterans. Like they made an exception for Mark Kelly. Mark Kelly, who also was apparently driving a Tesla to work on the Hill and had to make excuses for that too. But
that you're right that would normally be a major faux pas. But look, obviously I'm not saying it's just the individual. I'm saying that when the cycle is appropriate, this person will emerge, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a military veteran. I'm just saying that Democrats will produce. It's good for them that Trump won because he's precipitating huge changes that will refresh their ranks. And meanwhile, he's suppressing some of the talent that was in the Republican Party that was younger. And so anyway, the cycle will sort of move on.
All right, we've got 8 more minutes together. Do we want to continue on this? Is there anything else we want to talk about with Cousin Matt?
I mean, do you guys have any further comments on the France thing? Just because it's topical, and I'd be
Why
interested.
don't you give us? Yeah, why don't you give us your assessment? So basically, Marine Le Pen has been barred from running for the next 5 years for public office, and obviously, she was the presumptive next president of France, given the polling and her performance. So, do you want to give us your thoughts on that? We have not actually talked about this, Jacob, right? We haven't addressed this on the pod.
We have not talked about it yet. I have a take, but I'm eager to hear Matt's first.
Well, here's the thing, though. So I'm happy to tell you what I think, but this is an area where there's a lot of feedback, right? Because a lot of my views on France, well, my wife speaks French, and I spent a lot of time there, but also comes from working with Marko. So I've been following this Le Pen saga for the whole time that I've worked with Marko, and that's a long time now. It's like 18 years on and off, right? So I just have the suspicion that I would say 2 things. One, I think in order to have the anti-establishment right win the 2027 election, I do think you have to sort of have more bad news. So, in other words, if the French economy and the global economy are just sort of plodding along between now and 2027, then I don't really think Le Pen was lined up to win. She was doing well and better than she had been, and she had learned to adjust her policies to have a broader base. But I don't think she was a shoo-in, is what I'm saying. Now she's removed. What I kind of think that does is it actually energizes the national rally, because it gives this party they get to say, okay, well, she's a martyr. Now we're fighting for liberty. They all get to circle the wagons. And they also, Jordan Bardella has the torch. They do have a successor. I think there will be a challenge, and I think there'll be some power struggle. But as long as they do circle around one individual and they don't just totally screw it up and drop the ball, then they probably will be a more motivated party going into 2027. And then in order to really win the thing, I think you'd need to have a continued weak economy, which is probably the case. There's not really much of a positive impetus. A lot of the structural factors that have been driving people um, into the national rallies fold, a lot of those things continue. So so anyway, it's too early to call it an election that's 2 years away, but it wasn't a shoe in, and I'm not sure that removing her does anything except maybe slightly help her party.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with that. I would sharpen your point a little bit and just say there was no chance that anyone with the last name Le Pen was ever winning a French presidential election. I don't care how good she was doing in the polls. Like Jean Marie was odious, and the majority of French society thinks that. And she is too tied to Jean Marie and all the things that he used to talk about that for her to get elected. So I think this is the best possible thing that could have happened for the far right in France. And the thing that I'm most nervous about when I think about my like optimistic case for Europe going forward is what happens if exactly what you said happens. Like, okay, Le Pen is to the side, you get some new blood in there, she's the martyr, and then a Eurosceptic government takes over in Paris. Like, that to me is the biggest threat to the future of the European Union, because if Paris and Berlin are not on the same side, like, we're just going to be stuck talking about how the EU can't get anything done for another couple of years, and they're out of time. They have to make the changes now, or the world is going to leave the EU behind. So that's where I'm sitting.
Well, I think my counter to that would be that, we had that happen in Italy, and the quote unquote Eurosceptics. I mean, Fratelli d'Italia, Giorgia Meloni's party is like basically has been a neo-fascist party for a very long time. And they've completely become centrist. So other than Alternative for Deutschland, every single populist party, quote unquote anti-establishment, right-wing Eurosceptic party has basically toned down the Euroscepticism part, starting with Marine Le Pen. She was actually the first to do this. She's been followed by Geert Wilders, by the Swedish Democrats, by Fratelli d'Italia, by Five Star Movement, by Vox in Spain. Everyone's effectively dialed up the anti-immigrant lever and dialed down the Euroscepticism. And in fact, I would argue that Marine Le Pen's transformation of her party has really taken it into sort of classical Euroscepticism of Charles de Gaulle, which is like, you hate on the Commission, you hate on the bureaucrats, you hate on the kind of unelected, part of Europe, but you're not opposed to European integration. And in fact, you promote it as a counter to the ills that have befallen France. Famously, from Charles de Gaulle's perspective, it was America, which is very similar to today. And so I'm actually not concerned. Like, I think that if Bordella comes in, he'll be another Meloni. And so it's kind of irrelevant. Quite from a perspective of European integration, is just irrelevant. AFD, Alternative for Deutschland, hasn't done that transformation. I admit that. They're the one holdout. But everyone else has, even Geert Wilders has in the Netherlands. And I think that's, that should be noted. Like, it should be like kind of just like cited, and we need to think about why. And it's because the median European just doesn't want to leave Europe, and all these parties are reacting to the political incentives of trying to get to power.
I think you are shamelessly ingratiating yourself to the Italians and the Spaniards and all these other places, hoping that they'll invite you because you're putting them on the same level as France. Like, it's Paris and Berlin and then everybody else. And even if it is a far right government that, is constrained by some of these things that you're talking about, I think that's enough of a schism between Paris and Berlin that things would get really difficult. But
here's the thing. There's a strategic moment here that France is designed to capture. Like,
yes,
they're the nuclear power. They're the strategic leader during a moment of crisis. Unlike, when it was a sovereign debt crisis, you've got to have the German leader come forward. But this is different. And so for a French leader, and even with de Gaulle, like, it's not hatred of America. It's just ensuring that France retains a place in the world. And in this case, they have a great vehicle, which is the European Union. So you would be a complete buffoon to take over the French presidency at this moment, in the late 2020s, and then go and pick a big fight with Germany. It could happen, but what would be a lot more sensible would be to convince the Germans to restart, nuclear energy and buy French weapons. Like that would be a much more reasonable approach. And or if nothing else, just continuing to coordinate with them in order to avoid having Americans steal territory in Greenland or Russians steal territory in Ukraine.
That's fair. All right. Go ahead, Matt. Final word to you.
Look, I mean, all I can say, gentlemen, is that I'm I'm excited you're doing this. I'm game. And I think the thing about geopolitics right now is that you do have to separate yourself from the belief that institutions don't evolve, right? So even though we're having this whole discussion, I think you're right to point out, Jacob, that the constitutional mechanisms are not, these are not like theoretical debates. Basically, somebody's got to enact. But I think the interesting thing about Republican government, and I'm saying that with a lowercase r, is Republican government. It involves balance of power. It involves tensions between, and so the branches actually will wage conflict with each other in a way. And I think that's maybe one of the biggest things that's been missing from the discussions that I see is that there's a realism to Republican government, and that's why Machiavelli was the one writing about it so much. Those branches are going to fight, but as long as they don't actually try to kill each other, then they can prevent that fight from becoming a civil war.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the thing about Trump is that he's breached norms in a very significant way. And those norms were enough to keep some of these conflicts at bay. I think the institutions are going to get tested here in the coming years, especially in the United States. And they haven't been tested for, quite some time.
That's fair.
Okay, we'll get us out of there on that.
Yeah, that sounds like a good closing note. Awesome, guys.